All right. So all of this stuff like this, these data structures, these algorithms, like all of the thought behind them and, you know, work behind them is done. Like you would never go write an like merge sort to sort arrays because like, you know, Ruby and whatever languages like already has that. So, you know, you might need to go create like some of these to implement something of your own, but you would kind of know how to do it. What you're going to need to know how to do as you, and this is a skill, this definitely takes years, is it's kind of going in and selecting the right tool for the right problem. So you could ask like, what is the best way to sort in an array? And, you know, people just want there to be a best way to do something like, and I think you want that like in code, you're like, how do I do this? Like, what are the steps? Like, what's the one way I do this? Or what's the best UI library to use? What's the one way to do this? And it's like, the answer is generally going to be, it depends. Like, what's the best way to store data? It depends. How do you want to use it? So you become more familiar with the tools, with how to use them, and then you know your use case, and you can then go pick the right tools for the job. So, I mean, just kind of like a basic thing with this, like if you want to know like what is the best sorting algorithm, it's like, I don't know, it depends. Is your array almost sorted? If it's almost sorted, then, you know, insertion sort's probably the best. But if it's not almost sorted, or if it's reversed, then insertion sort becomes like one of the worst. And then you might be like, I just care about like the average case. And then you might choose between like merge sort or heap sort. But then you might say like, which one's better? And you can like look at how much memory it takes. So this is kind of like analogous to like when we're like picking libraries or like when we're deciding to do stuff. There's going to be a lot of options on the table. So we just got to be a little more familiar with like kind of the details of that. So even though like a lot of this work is being done for us, we don't have to do it. We still want to have some knowledge or like a way to go get knowledge about it. So once again, this kind of comes down to like the docs, like reading docs, reading documentation. You know, a lot of this stuff, it's like you can't really be expected to like memorize a whole bunch of this stuff, but we can always like coding in my mind, like it's an open book thing. It's an open Google thing. You can always go on Google and just look at stuff. Cool. So let's shift gears and go back to React and kind of look at hooks in a little more detail and kind of go back to lifecycle methods. So what I'm going to do is create a React app. So you're going to create React app. Let's just call this React demo. It's maybe hooks. Okay. So just creating a React app. Give that a second to build. Okay, so we can cd into there. Let's open this up in code. All right. Okay, let's just run this yarn start. It's all up and running. Let's throw this right here. Come on. Trying to get my app down here. There we go. Sweet. So let's think about, just before we do this, let's just go back here. So when we're thinking about lifecycle methods, let's think about our component mounting to the DOM. And then as it's on the DOM, we can like update. We can update it. We can give it new props and we can set the state. So we'll just look at these two. We'll kind of ignore this force update one. And then we can unmount. So let's do a class. So for this, let's do a class component. Just a little review. So I'll just I'm going to do a counter. Let's do our basic counter. So import React from React. So we do a class counter extends React component or curly brackets. Remember, with a class component, we need a render function, and this returns our JSX. Export default counter. So if I'm looking at this mounting diagram, so we have, that's the render function we just defined, render. We also, and notice the order, this is the order too, like it's giving us the order of things. So let's do our constructor as well. Remember, our constructor takes props, and then we call super props. Remember, this is a class thing where we're calling the constructor in our React component. For now, we can do like some console.logs. Let's just say counter constructor call. And here, I can do counter render called. Well, if I like this, so we're going to call the constructor, we're going to call the render method. That's going to update the DOM, which means it's going to like plop the stuff on your browser. And then we're going to call this component did mount function. So component did mount. Actually, so notice this one's component did mount, this one's component did update. So we have our component did mount, and now we can just do a log right here. So as far as order, this is 1. This is 2. And this is 3. That's the order these are going to be called in. Maybe I'll just throw these in the right here. One. Actually, I don't want to throw it because this one actually can be called. We'll see this render can be called multiple times. Cool. So there's my counter example. Let's go use it. Let's go plop that in my app.js counter. Use import. If I inspect, just clear that, refresh. My constructor's called, my render's called, and then my component did mount's called. I mean, a lot is happening, but computers are really fast. So we mount. So we call it, we're about getting ready to mount. This is like the whole mounting process. We call our constructor, we render, we actually go update the DOM, and then we call our component did mount. So what triggers this to be re-rendered? Well, we can set our state. So let's give this counter some state. Just right here, let's call this state. Let's give it some count state. Set it equal to 0. And let's go ahead and do our count. This is a class component, so it's going to be this.state.count. And on my button, I could have a add. So I do an on click. Where I could do. Let's just do this. Let's call this increment. Let's just do this in a function. Increment. It's not increment. I don't need the const. That is an arrow function. Where I call this dot set state. Let's do count goes to this dot state dot count +1. I just want to add 1 to my count. Maybe if this is more clear, I could say let new count equal this. Just to break this up in its own line, maybe make this more readable. So there's the set state. So notice what this is saying. Hey, when we call set state, this is going to trigger a render, which updates the DOM, which then calls a component did update. So we don't have that one defined. So let's go ahead and make this function component did update. I'm just going to throw logs in here so we can see these functions being called. Let's say after component is re-rendered. Increment is not defined. I do this all the time. It's this dot increment. Clear. Let's refresh to have another error. This dot state is not a function. Oh yeah, this dot state, I need to have that equal an object. It's just clear. Okay, so I mount this. So we have our constructor called, our render called, and our component did mount. That is this part. That's done. That happens once when it mounts to the DOM. Now we're kind of in this updating phase. So if I go and click add, and let me just throw in another log right here. Because right here, we're going to call the set state method is going to get called right here. So I'll just do a console.log. This is how we can like really see how these methods are working, is by doing logs. Okay, we do our constructor, our render, our component did mount. Click, and then I'll just clear those out. Click add. So the counter set state method is called. That calls the render. And then that calls the component did update. And every time I click add, it's calling those, it's calling the set state, it's calling the render, and it's calling the component did update. So what if I do this? I do this dot set state count. This dot state. Let's just say like I want to like reset my count for some reason when my component updates. Refresh. Just blew up really quick, right? So there we go. There's our, it's kind of like a different way that we saw it, but maximum update depth exceeded. That's our Stack Overflow error. That's where having our, we saw that with the Fibonacci call that we did when I took out that base case. It does not like that, because what am I doing? I'm calling this dot set state and component did update. Well, what does this dot set state do? It triggers render, which triggers the component did update, and boom, now I'm in an infinite loop, which is going to overflow my stack. It's going to overfill it up. So with my component did update, I can actually, this actually knows about the previous props and the previous state. Let me ask you this. So this is, I'm defining a function that is called component did update. React is going to know about this. But I don't know. I'm a little unsure which one's the props and which one's the state. Do you think it's more important that I name them right or that the order is right? Like by the name, does it matter that it's X or Y, or like the order of these is important, or does it need to be like state spelled right and prop spelled right?
Probably the order, right?
Yeah, it's going to be the order. I'm not sure what the order is. I know this function, it will give me like the previous props and previous state. I'm just not sure about the order. So I'm going to do a console.log and just see what X is and see what Y is. And then once I figure them out, then I'll name them correctly. So it makes more sense as far as readability. Let's go ahead, clear that. I'm going to click, oh, and let's also get rid of this set state. So I'm going to click add. Okay, so X is empty, Y is this object that has count in it. Well, that looks like my state, right? And it's actually my previous state because in this value, it's 0, but in my UI, it's 1. So, okay, this is my previous state. And this is actually my previous props. So what I could do something like this, I could be like, I could check, hey, if my previous state dot count equals, 10, then I can like set the count to 0. So this is not going to be an infinite loop because I have this check. I'm checking to see if the count is 10, then I set the state. If it's not 10, then I don't. So what this has the effect of doing is like I can click add. And once I get to 10, it resets it to 0. So I'm using that component did update method to like check the value. So when I click add here, it resets it. I'm going to Slack this little demo out. All right, let's do one more thing. I'm going to wrap all of this in my app just so I can like remove these elements. I'm going to do like a show things state. And I set show things state. It's going to be useState. True by default. What I want, I just kind of, this should be a const. I just want to be able to not like toggle these things. So I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to do a const render things function. So I'm going to throw a whole bunch of items in here. It's going to return, div. Because why I'm doing this is I want to have us show the component did unmount callback. So I'm just throwing my counter component in here. And I'm going to use like this Boolean. So I can go like show things and render things. So if this is true, I'm going to call this function and render my things. If not, I won't. And inside of here, I can have a button. Toggle things. One click. So I can just do this, do my function to just toggle this set show things to not show things. So I'm just creating this state show things that's being able to, conditionally render, my components. And this is just giving me a way to like remove and add stuff to my DOM. Let me see if this is working and then I'll like Slack it out. Okay, so if I hit refresh, that stuff renders. If I click toggle things, it removes it. If I toggle it back, notice that constructor is being called again, render things being called, component then mounts being called. Because I'm actually removing it from the DOM. And there's a method, let me Slack this out so we can see this, so you can have it. My app.js. So what I'm going to add in my counter.js is this unmounting function. So there's actually a callback we have, or this function component will unmount. Component will unmount. Console.log. We'll just do our counter. Component will unmount called. So here I can add things, or I can like add. So, well, let me just start over. So I refresh, I call my constructor, my render, my component did mount. So that's like, you know, I could even add a log here to maybe make this a little more clear, to be like, mounting phase done. Refresh, constructor, render, component did mount. So like that mounting phase is done. And now we're kind of in like that updating phase. And you know, this can happen as long as we're like updating our UI, but this counter component is still on the DOM, like we can still see it. And then I click toggle things, and then the counter component will unmount called. And then maybe just visually to see this, like no longer DOM. So mounting phase is done. I click this toggle things, you know, that unmounts called. And so like the counter is no longer on this DOM. So it's been unmounted. Unmounted. Right? Unmounted. Why did that not save? Save. It's unmounted. So like if I toggle things again, it needs to it's remounting. So it needs to do those like that mounting phase again, because it was unmounted. Is this any questions on this? It's kind of understanding this, like this cycle. These kind of three main phases: the mounting, updating, unmounting. And then, you know, we can do certain things during these phases. So I think one thing that I want to go into a little more detail is how giving a component new props triggers this to re-render. So what does that mean? Let's go ahead and in our counter, let's do something. Let's go ahead and in our, so what we have this toggle, right? That we're able to toggle. Let's maybe show how many times we've toggled this. So I'm going to do like a toggle count. I'm going to keep track of this toggle count. I want to make something very clear. This is living in app.js, right? This state is living in app.js. And I'm going to write a function called toggle, because we're going to do, this is just doing one thing. I'm going to want to now do two things in here. So I'm going to write this in its own function. So I'm going to go ahead and, you know, put this in here. I'll just call toggle here. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to also here set toggle count to be count plus 1. And then I can do like a, let's just do like an HR here. And let's do it. Let's just have a count, or let's say this like, you know, toggled count. So I'm just adding some state to count how many times I've clicked this button. Count is not defined. What line is that? App.js line 18. It's not count, it's going to be this toggle count state. Okay. So when I toggle this, you see I'm changing the count of how many times I've toggled this. It has nothing to do with this count state. Right? Quite like anything, any confusion here? Let's maybe throw this. I don't like how it's toggling. It's a little nitpicky, but I'm just going to put this button up above. So like that's not like, it's not moving when I toggle that. Okay, so I have these two states, they're completely different. But what I can do, let's just say I want to like pass something down to my counter. Well, why don't something that's changing in my app state? Because I want to show how sending new props to a component triggers it to re-render. And you know, this counter is just going to take some, I'm going to give this some, just give it some number prop. Okay, and I'm setting this some num prop to this toggle count. So this is a way I'm, you know, this counter component has a prop that I'm just calling some number. And I'm setting the value equal to this toggle count that I'm able to change the state in the app.js. So what happens to my counter component when I change a prop to it in like a parent component? Well, let's see. Let's go. Let's use that. Let's just say count state in counter. And then I'm also going to do like we call that some number prop, right? That's going to be this dot props dot some number. So notice how the sum number prop is 32. That's coming from this value. And if I click add, or if I toggle this, oh, this is on mounting it though. Damn, I don't want this to mount. Let's do this. I don't want this to unmount right now. So I'm going to cheat a little. I'm just going to not toggle this. I'm just going to update the count. So what I want to show, okay, so I'm going to clear. I'm going to toggle this. Notice, so this right now, this is just changing my count state in my app, but notice how it's changing that prop in my counter. And what do we see when this state is changed, or when I'm changing what I'm passing? I get the render called and I get the component did update called. Because what's happening is I'm sending that component new props. So that gives it the render method and component did update. Right? Because this counter prop I'm giving it is called, the prop is called some number. The value is toggle count. Well, when I change this, that's giving this counter a new value for that prop, which calls the re-render and calls the component did mount. Now, this is very important to understand. So I want to, like this part right here, how we're giving this component, our counter component, we're giving it new props, like we're giving it a new value for that some num, because that value is changing. So it's going to trigger the render and component did update in that counter class. And then we could also log in the component did update. Do pre-state, previous props. Refresh. So I'm just going to toggle this. See that the some number prop is 9, but previously the value was 8. Count is still 0. So I'm toggling things. And maybe to make this more clear in the UI, I say toggle things. Maybe like just so the demo, I'm just going to like update. This is really what this is doing, update toggle count in app.js. Right here, we're updating the toggle count in update.js, but we're also passing that toggle count to our counter as a prop. So that calls the render and it calls the component did update in our counter class. If you're confused about this, now is the time to ask questions about any of this.
I get lost when you go into the specifics, or when you really dig into something, but then the glance over always helps. So could you maybe do like a brief reiteration of everything?
Yeah, okay, so let's look at the code. And maybe to simplify this, I don't need to do this because I wanted to show this being unmounted and mounted, but for now, let's just do it like this. And then maybe just visually, just so this is a little easier to see, like style equals. Just want to give these a border. And then here, let's do black. I'll say right here, like H1 app. Let's try to make this very visually. Oh man, I got rid of that style. I like that centered. think this was just an app. What's the class name? Does anyone know? Oh, it's capital A. Okay, that just centers it. Okay. So I have my app component, that's the black, and then I have this green counter component living inside of it. So I'm just going to refresh. So we have this state. We have this toggle count in our app.js. And I can comment that out for now. And so what I'm doing with this toggle state is I have an on click where I'm adding it in my app.js, right? Like, and I can just even hide this for now, that counter. I just have a counter in this app component, right? Just a counter example. Boom. That's all I'm doing. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add my counter component, and I'm going to give this some number prop, which I'm going to set equal to this toggle count state. So now in my counter component, it's getting this toggle count state as a prop called some number. And then I can like render it in there. So if I update the state in my app, it's going to give it a new, like it's giving it new props because that state in my app is changing and it's passing that props to my counter. Well, that needs to trigger a re-render. And if I call a re-render, that's going to call my component did update. So my counter component mounts, and I'm changing state in my app, but I'm passing that state to my counter as props, but I'm calling some number prop. And now that needs to update because that's getting a new value for that prop, right? If that didn't re-render, then this value would not update. Does that make sense? Like my counter has this some number prop, which value is toggle count. So when my toggle count changes, if I'm looking at my counter component, like really this props.some number is going to be changing. Well, I'm going to want to re-render that, or that wouldn't show this change. So React does that. It's saying, hey, React is going to render a component when it gets new props. Or it's going to re-render when you call the setState method in it. So I can trigger that by setting the state in my counter component. So that's causing the component, the render and the component did update to be called.
Are you basically just trying to show us like order of operations?
Yeah, or like this is not really a, it's order of operations, but I think something, it's order of operations, but it's kind of this maybe a little inception-y level, but I'm changing like this, like a component's going to re-render if the prop it has, if that value changes. Like if this toggle count changes, it's going to trigger, this counter to do. And then I could do something like in my component did update. I could do something like this. If previous props Now this is not going to be count. I'm calling that prop some number. I could alert yo. Some number is 10. Let's refresh. So it's my counter component that's changing that, or that's going to do this alert. So once that gets, once the previous prop is greater than 10, it's going to alert this. Kind of a little silly example, but so these are the lifecycle methods. And it's good to like have these in mind, what these are like kind of doing. And what triggers, stuff to be rendered, what triggers this component did update, and this kind of thing. So to review, because this is a class component. And yeah, back before hooks, it's like if you wanted to have these methods of like component did mount, component did update, component will unmount, how would you do this? You'd have to use a class component, but now we can do this in functional components with hooks. So let's do a new file.
Which ones are the hooks? What ones are what part of this is the hooks?
We haven't seen a hook yet.
We're not hooks.
So let's do a counter hook. So yeah, we're going to do a little deeper dive into hooks today and just the useEffect. Okay. Do const counter equals. Now I'm doing a functional component. Return div. And we can say h1, like here's my counter. And I'll just do like the functional component. I call this counter hooks. Default counter hooks. Do not want to import counter. I'm not using that. Okay, for now, I'm just gonna comment out this one so we don't have all those logs. And we're just gonna focus on this counter hooks component for a second. Counter hooks. Okay, so there's my counter functional component. Just a little bit of setup there. So my app still has this toggle. I probably am I might throw this back into the render thing so we can toggle it. But let's just kind of stick with this for now. Okay. So we're kind of talking about like hooks. So what are hooks? So hooks are a new feature in React. I think it's like 16.8. Anything greater than 16.8, you can use hooks. So there are some rules to hooks. So you can only use hooks in functional components. So this can like, sometimes if you're deciding, do I write a class component or do I writing a functional component? This can be a pretty good guideline. Well, if you want to use hooks, you have to use a functional component. You cannot use hooks in a class component. Okay, another thing with hooks, hooks always start with the use. useEffect, useState. There's other ones like use callback, use reducer, use ref, use. These are all hooks. These are the ones we've spent the most time with. Use, I think maybe the only two. Oh, we've also used what, use context. That's another hook that we used. So I'm going to say this like, and more. There's others are defined by React. And come, standard. Things like use router or like what do we have? Like use location. Use params. And let me just say it like this. You can define you and third-party libs can define their own hooks.
Use navigate would be a third-party one as well, right?
Yeah. For example, use location, use params are defined by React router. And today we'll define our own. We'll see. We'll go create our own custom hook. And there are like many of these out there, including our own. So there can be a lot of hooks. Like a hook, you can it's just a way to like share code. So hooks are just really, a way to create reusable code, functionality. React, they are specific to React. So let me so that's one rule. This is another rule. I'm going to do a third rule. Hooks must be used at top level of function. This means like you can't nest a hook in a function, like an if statement, etc. Like I can't have some function inside of here like const x and say, let s and d equal like useState or useEffect or whatever useState. Can't do that because I'm using useState in a function. They have all hooks, not just useState, but all hooks need to be like at this outer level in your component. Can't have like an if statement. Can't do stuff like that. Does that make sense? So those are our basic rules and rules we have to follow when we're creating hooks and using hooks. So they can only be in functional components. They need to start with the use word, and they can't be nested inside of anything other than like this, like the component function itself. Like at the top level of it. And yeah, React has given us some default ones. There's a lot. I think there's like 10 or 12 that React has defined that come standard with React, but then we can define our own. And we can use predefined hooks in our hooks. So, and we'll see that example. All right. So we've really dived into like the useState hook and the useEffect hook. Because these ones are really important. These like, so the useState allows us to have state in a functional component. You know, before hooks, if we wanted to have state, we had to have a class component, and, you know, we had to set up our state there. So the useState allows us to have state and, you know, and update state in a functional component. So I could do my const, you know, count, set count equals useState. Count. So with this, I'm going to put a log here, counter hooks rendering. It's not like it's in the render function because we don't have a render function, but we can think like right before this return, this is put in a console.log here is like essentially saying, hey, this is about to be rendered, or this is like rendering. Or I could just say rendered. I mean, it's a little off, but let's just say rendering. So let's clear this. Let's refresh. So my counter hooks is rendering. Now, if I look at this, this is kind of not quite the same. So we don't have a constructor. We don't have a render method, but we are rendering here. So we're updating the DOM. So we can think of this as like, in quotes, you know, the render method. Counter hooks render. So how do we do this componented mount? Well, that's what the useEffect gives us. This allows us to have lifecycle methods. What are those lifecycle methods that we saw? It was those three. It was component did mount, component did update, and component, I'm just going to write these on a new line, component will unmount. useEffect is this magic function that gives us all three of these. So we can define our useEffect, or we call our useEffect function. Console.log. counter hooks mounted. I'm going to put an empty array right here. Let's go ahead. Let's refresh this. So we have our counter hooks rendered, and then I can call that mounted method. And this is useful because this is where we like, a lot of the times we want to do like Axios calls and like, you know, because really what we want to do is we want to wait until like our components mounted before we maybe do some stuff. So we know our like things there. So this is like, once it's mounted, like this is a good time to do an Axios call. So we know it's there. We know it's ready for the data. We don't want to do the Axios call before we're mounted because maybe we would get the data before we're mounted and then we want to be able to render it. It's kind of unlikely, but it could happen. So we're just going to be sure that our DOM's ready to go, grab the data, and now we can render it. And that's what we could do here in our component did mount function, wherever it is. All right, so how do we do the component did update? Now this is where this gets a little tricky or a little confusing. I saw someone like threw out like the useEffect thing, the migraine thing, and it's like, you don't know the half of it because now we're gonna learn the other half of it. Okay, so first of all, I can have multiple useEffects called. So what I'm going to do is, and we're going to maybe see what this array is doing. I'm going to throw count inside of here. So instead of just having this empty array, I'm now going to throw in this. And for now, let's just do like a counter hooks with, you know, count. And let's just do this counter hex useEffects with, so we can see which one's being called. Okay, so I refresh. So I see that the rendered method's called, and I see both of these useEffects are being called. Oh wait, I don't have any state in here, do I? I have this count state, but I actually need to update this state. I need a way to update this. So let's do add. Let's do on click. Just need to like set this count, set count. Count this one. I need a way to change this state because we're not going to see this until we actually update our state. Okay, so let's refresh. So we get our render right before that return, and then we have both of those useEffects called. Now I'm going to click the add button. So we get that render called, but the useEffect with count is called, not the one that's empty, because I'm changing the state of count. So what happens is this will get called, you know, on mount and when count state, or I should say this, and when set count is called. Counts. Also say this count state changes. Let's just create some other state. Let's just create some more count state, count 2. Set count 2. So now I have 2 count states. So I'm going to clear this. So I'm going to click add. Let's refresh. So I get those two useEffects called. Now I'm just changing my count to state. It doesn't call that other useEffect because that useEffect is only listening for the change of count, not the count to state. Does that make sense? How now we have this component did update. We can listen to changes in state. So here I could do something like if, count equal 10, go ahead and set count to 0. And that, resets that to 10. I could do a useEffect. I can do another one. A useEffect that listens to both. So now I have 3 useEffects. So when I refresh, they're all going to get called on mount. Now, the second one's going to get called when either count or count2 changes. And then there's one that only gets called when the count changes. So there you go. There's the component did update on useEffect. All right. Let's do the component will unmount that we saw right here. It's a lot more in a class component, just this nice named function. Let's do that here. Well, so this is a good little inception. So useEffect, it's just a function. Takes a function, we'll say that's param1 and dependency array. It's going to be our param2. Right? Do you see this? There's our first parameter. That's a function. And then the second parameter, argument, is the dependency array. And now we kind of see what this array is doing. It's a way we can pass in our state. And if that state changes, it will act like a component did update. But the function that useEffect takes can return a function that will be called, unmount. I'm going to just take this down here. Just look at what this is saying. So the useEffect is a function. So break this down into parts. Simple enough, right? It's a function. We can call it. Okay. Let's go part 2. useEffect is a function that, well, just part 2. Let's just do this. takes a function param2 and a dependency array. There's my function as the first param, and there's the dependency array as the second param. So, and I'm going to say like, let's just go like look into this. I'm going to call this like a callback function. Takes a callback function. Let's do part 3. This callback function can, will get called on mount, and also when state changes, if that state is in dependency array. Does this part make sense? So I can now say like, this will be called on mount. And like if we had count in here, and when count state changes. It's kind of like breaking this up into parts. useEffect is just a function. Here's it is. We pass this function 2 parameters, a callback function and an array. So this function we pass it, this callback function, will be called on mount. And when state changes, if that state is in the dependency array. So in this example, this is going to be called on mount. And when state changes, if I have this would only be called on mount. There's actually a third option if you do no dependency array. So if you don't give it that second argument, it's going to be called on mount and when any state changes. This can be like, can lead to Stack Overflow if you're not careful. So let's say we're always probably going to have like an empty array, or like we're going to tell what state, but you can not pass in that dependency array.
This happened to my team during the hackathon. I can't remember what the exact situation was, but we forgot to add that array, and it was just looping like crazy.
Yeah, because if you have
everything was rendering fine still, but if you inspected the page, you could see that it was.
Yeah, let's say you do a like get data. And that's not in your useEffect, but that get data call does an Axios call. Whatever, Axios. And then you set data. Well, what does that do? That you call your get data, that calls another function, which calls, your Axios, but then you're calling that set function. So you're changing your state. Well, what does that do? If you don't have that dependency array, it goes through and will trigger that to be called again.
Yeah, that's what was happening.
So that's an infinite loop. So yeah, and when I said when I told you to say useEffect, I know I did say always throw that empty array in there. I can't really explain what it means, but if you don't, you're going to run into an infinite loop. So now we can, I didn't want to go into all this detail to explain why. I was just like, here's something you have to do, or it's probably going to break your code. And I'm still going to say you're probably always going to want this, or specifically say which one you want to listen to. Like if you're writing your useEffect without the dependency array, and you don't know what you're doing, you're probably going to get an infinite loop. Unless you have like a specific reason for why you're doing that. Okay, so we're still, and yeah, useEffect is like, this is why there's that image. It's just like, what? It does so much. And we're still not quite done with like kind of this statement part 4, which is the function, or let's say this, the callback function that useEffect takes as its first, argument, can return a function. So let's just say this. So useEffect is a function where we can pass it. Its first argument is a function. And this function can return a function that will be called onMount. Just go watch this part of the video 20 times.
OnMount or unmount?
Unmount, called when
Okay.
component unmounts. Yeah, this is okay, so let's see that in action. So for this, I'm going to do this in here. It probably doesn't make sense to have multiple, it definitely can make sense to have multiple useEffects, but it probably just makes sense to have one of them do your unmount stuff. So this one's going to return a function. It's about log mounted. Well, actually, there is a difference. Okay. Or let's not say unmounted. Let's say what this is. Return CB called. This one's this really confusing one. Okay. So I am going to show that I'm going to put 2 of these return callbacks in here. Okay. Now notice I didn't unmount, but that callback was called. So that might not be how you want this to work, because this is trying to duplicate the unmount function, but it's calling this. So like this is getting called even though component didn't mount. I can't think of like why you would need this that you couldn't just do in this function. There might be, I'm sure there's a case for it, which is why they're doing it, but I can't really think of it, but so I'm just going to leave that there. But notice how this one, this counter hook useEffect return DB called, this one is not getting called. Like I don't see this getting called when I'm like changing anything. And that's good because I only want to like do this when this component unmounts. All right, well now we need to make this component unmount. So let's do this render things function again. And instead of, rendering this in here, let's do it in our place where we can toggle stuff. And then, so now I'm throwing it back in this UI where I can like remove it from the DOM, right? I can like remove that. So let's refresh. Okay. So now I can go in. So just to reiterate, like I have that like render function. So for rendering, and then I can have these weird like component did mount calls. And then I can go in, I can change state. I can kind of choose what useEffect hook I'm calling depending on which state is changing. And life's good. And then I unmount the component. And then I get that callback called, the one with the empty dependency array. That's the useEffect with the return callback called. So that's like what this might make more sense to say like, unmounted. So now when that actually unmounts, it calls that unmounted callback. And there we go. How's that for confusing on useEffect?
Yep, thoroughly confused.
I thought the breakdown was very, very helpful, though.
And yet this
I have
is
a migraine.
yeah, this took me like a quick second to like be able to, and by quick second, I mean like hours to like really be able to like go through all like these fine little details. Like, so it's there's a lot that you can do with it. So, but with useState and useEffect, just with those two hooks, really we can pretty much do all the things we now can do with class components. All right, let's take a quick breather. And since we're kind of spending so much time on hooks, I just wanted to write our own little custom hook when we get, or like maybe a couple of them. And then we'll take lunch. And I'm just going to create a repo and then I'll Slack out the repo for this.
Did you have any tutorials or examples that helped you when you were learning this?
I think like Log Rocket has some good ones that they're like really in depth. I don't know
Right.
if they're gonna be a little too much, but they I can slack those out. Those ones, that one had a lot. Let me
I'm
find.
probably going to be scouring YouTube also.
For me, like it was like, I mean, you can go to like the docs.
Right.
Uh,
That helps a little bit, but the it's hard for me to wrap my head around the terminology a lot of times.
I think like, yeah, it might be. And since I think part of the problem, like why I haven't like shown too many resources is so many resources, they use, they're kind of assuming, you know, you're coming from class components.
Mhm.
So they're like, oh, here's a class component. Now here's how you would do it with the hooks. So
Right.
they're good tutorials, but they're like, they're assuming maybe you know more about class components than you do.
Right.
But this one actually. But now, you know, we have spent like today and, you know, Monday, we did spend some time with class components. So I'm more fine with you now seeing, because then like that's going to be good too, because now you're going to would be good because it would like kind of show you the class example too. I'm trying to think if this is, oh yeah, this one has a good little picture of the hooks.
Thank you for that. When do you
Yeah.
want to check?
Let's do 11:35. So I'll select this one out. And then, yeah, they have one on useState too. That's, like I said, it's a little more in depth, but that's not going to hurt.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.